started today. So welcome to today's coffee break. I'm Brandon Viroff. I'm the chair of the Education Committee. We are excited to feature this networking opportunity with the Missouri Gateway chapter of the U.S. Green Building Council. Today, we have some members and non-members of our chapter, so thank you for joining us. Our chapter, like many other nonprofits throughout the country, rely on funding, and the biggest source is through our memberships. If you aren't already a member, please consider joining. The goal of our coffee breaks are to provide an opportunity for our community to engage in conversational hot topics over a cup of coffee and a short 30-minute break. Our theme for today's conversation is updates on the City of St. Louis's Building Energy Performance Standard. Today, I'm excited to introduce our special guest, Rajiv Ravulapati, Government Services Analyst of City of St. Louis. Rajiv is the program manager for the new Office of Building Performance in the Building Division for the City of St. Louis. He has overseen the implementation of the city's benchmarking ordinance since 2017. Beginning this year, Rajiv is also overseeing the Building Energy Performance Standard law that has passed in April 2020. Before working for the Buildings Division, Rajiv has also worked under many hats as consumer advocate, organizer, and lobbyist in Illinois and Missouri on issues of environmental justice, energy efficiency, clean energy, and public health. Some just brief guidelines before we jump in. The option to click on the grid view on the upper right-hand corner to view more callers. The chat function is accessible for anyone if you want to type in a comment, but please try to be respectful of others, allow others to jump into the conversation, and be mindful of not jumping over anyone speaking. Feel free, though, to talk without being called upon, but if you'd like to get into the conversation and you haven't been able to yet, just use one of those reactions below and I'll try to get you into the conversation. And finally, try to keep yourself muted unless speaking to avoid any background noise. Without further ado, Rajiv.
Great. Can you guys hear me all right? Cool. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to join the USGBC's coffee break. I've got a slide deck to show you. I'm going to skip around these slides. My presentation is only meant to be 5 to 10 minutes, and then, like Brandon said, 15, 20 minutes just for general discussion and for you guys to ask me questions about some of the updates I'll be providing. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you see the slide deck, Brandon?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So let's skip this slide. So, the reason I'm here today is to talk about some updates regarding the Building Energy Performance Standards Ordinance. Just as some context, anyone who's on this call understands that U.S. buildings have a very large impact and they produce a large portion of the greenhouse gas emissions that are experienced here locally on a state level and across the country. In the city of St. Louis alone, greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, and when I say buildings, I mean commercial, industrial, and residential buildings account for nearly 80% of those greenhouse gas emissions. On a federal level, it's close to 40%, specifically when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions. So here locally, addressing emissions and energy usage in St. Louis is one of the cornerstones of why the city passed a Building Energy Performance Standards Ordinance. So I'm going to quickly just run through, what BEPS is, some of the policy elements and the timeline that the building division and the city is currently operating under, the targets themselves, and then what we're doing right now in preparation to notifying building owners about the law and some next steps. So BEPS is the acronym you'll hear me using for a long period of time in this presentation, as well as everything related to this ordinance. And BEPS just stands for that ordinance, Building Energy Performance Standards. And so what it is, it's a legal requirement for building owners to ensure that their buildings meet a minimum level of energy performance. Hence why there is the standard. I may use the word standard or target in interchangeably, but that's what the standard is. The city has a greenhouse gas reduction goal. It's a non-binding resolution. It's 100% by 2050, but BEPS plays a significant portion in the city's overall decarbonization initiative. In the past couple of years, the city has been able to pass some progressive policies, not just simply related to buildings. We do have benchmarking, we have BEPS. The city now has a solar readiness ordinance. They have a electric vehicle readiness ordinance as well. And there are some projects being done right now in terms of transportation on the biking side of things and for electric buses. But those are initiatives being spearheaded by other departments within the city of St. Louis. But I wanted to kind of give some context that BEPS is not a ordinance that came out of the left field. It is a strategic, thoughtful ordinance built within the city's overall decarbonization strategy. This map right here just quickly shows folks all the jurisdictions around the country that have some sort of benchmarking or building performance standards ordinance. St. Louis is one of 4 jurisdictions that has a building performance standard ordinance. The others are Washington State, New York City, Washington, D.C., but there is actually, as of last week, there's now a 5th jurisdiction that now has a building performance standards ordinance, and that is the city of Boston. Instead of talking to you guys a bit about the progress, I'm just going to keep talking about the ordinance itself. So just making sure. Okay. So again, BEPS, some of the policy elements are each jurisdiction has their own chief performance metric. Our standards, our targets are based using local benchmarking data. In the ordinance, it calls for that standards are calculated such that at least 65% of the buildings have to improve their energy performance. Our standards are using weather normalized site energy use intensity, which is the amount of energy used per square foot on site at the building level, versus source energy use intensity, which takes into account the energy consumption of a building on site, but also includes things that are not in the control of a building owner, things like distribution, transmission, line losses, things like that. This ordinance affects buildings 50,000 square feet and above, similar to benchmarking. Municipal buildings, city buildings have to comply as well. Commercial, institutional, and multifamily buildings. And if you are wondering about what the targets are themselves, one of the things that the ordinance created is what's called the Building Energy Improvement Board. This is a 9-member board. That's one of their responsibilities that they're tasked with, is to approve the final targets for the various property types that we have in the city of St. Louis. Those were finalized back in May this year, and you can find them through this link on the that I'll share this slide deck, and I'll also share some additional follow-up items with the USGBC so they can send it out to folks who participated today. So the way the building owners will comply is continuing to use Portfolio Manager to document their compliance. So through that annual benchmarking report, we can monitor how closely buildings are to their respective target. One thing that's different between this policy and benchmarking is that data verification will be required when compliance is due. So for example, I'm going to talk a little bit about our compliance pathways right here. What I mean by data verification is the data that you're sending through Portfolio Manager has been approved by a third party, whether that's a professional engineer or architect verifying that data. When it comes to compliance, there are a couple options building owners can actually use to comply with the ordinance. That first compliance method is called what we call the performance pathway, where if your building is meeting the standard or it's below the standard and you maintain that level of performance, you simply don't have to do anything. You just have to continue to keep that performance up, and you're considered compliant. The second one is called what we're calling early adopters. This is meant to incentivize that deep energy improvement into buildings, where if you're already at or below that standard, that 35th percentile, and you reduce it by an additional 20%, your energy consumption, you can be compliant for multiple cycles, for cycles 1 and 2. So that could be, for most buildings, they have a 4-year compliance cycle. Whoops, I just jumped ahead. So I skipped this slide. Most buildings have 4 years to meet the standard by 2025. And then for qualified affordable housing and houses of worship, they've got 6 years to meet the standard. Apologies. Back to early adopters. If you are at or below that 35th percentile and you reduce by an additional 20%, you can be in compliance for 8 or 12 years, depending on what your property type is. For additional improvement by 50% or more, you can be compliant for cycles 1, 2, and 3. So for a long period of time. One thing that we've been developing this past summer and that was recently approved by the board back in July are water compliance pathways, but these 2 specific ones called an umbrella of alternative compliance pathways, where if you believe you cannot achieve either the performance or the early adopters compliance pathway, so you can't meet your target, then we're going to treat compliance as something different, where one option is percentage reduction, where if you can reduce your consumption by 50% between your baseline performance and whatever your target is for your property type, we will treat that as an alternative compliance plan, something that you can present to the city and to the board for approval or denial. If this is still not a feasible option for you, then we've got what we call a custom option. This is tier 2 within alternative compliance, where you have to get an ASHRAE level 2 audit done, and there has to be an agreement between the city and use the building owner based on those recommended energy conservation measures. The building owner will have to complete those by the end of the compliance cycle. There will be a technical report submitted and approved by our office, the Office of Building Performance, which will be tasked with enforcing, benchmarking, and BEPS. And there may be a charging fee, processing fee associated with this pathway, but we're still working on that right now as we're in rulemaking. I know I'm gonna take some of your questions. The last thing I'll just quickly mention before I get into your question is just some current next steps. So we're still working on some rulemaking elements of the ordinance right now, and we're also working on developing what we call a BEPS compliance guide, which will walk building owners all the way through, step 1 of getting notified about the ordinance to what happens by the end of compliance cycle, and kind of giving a decision tree, if you will, of what building owners will have to do based on their compliance pathway and anything related to the ordinance itself. One big thing that is happening this year, and I know I'll leave Emily and Freddie to talk about this, but the USGBC is launching a building energy exchange to support buildings that have to comply with BEPS. Earlier this month, they hired Kara Spencer, a name a lot of you folks may be familiar with. She's currently an alderperson. She ran for mayor earlier this year, and she's the new director for this building energy exchange. So this is meant to be a resource hub for those building owners who have to comply with BEPS, and they'll work in conjunction with our Office of Building Performance. We at the city are responsible for compliance enforcement, and BEPS, the Building Energy Exchange, will be focused on that resource hub. So that's a lot of stuff I just threw at you guys. There's still some things I didn't get a chance to talk about, but I'll stop there because I know this is the Q&A part of the coffee break.
So it looks like there's a number of different comments and questions that have come in. Some of them which are regarding compliance. So if an owner does not comply, I I guess first, is there sort of a recognition that you think that all of this is built on everyone complying mostly and being willing to, in good faith, work on this? And if they don't comply, are there any ideas or fines or actions for those who do not?
So, yeah, I think that question came from Chuck. Yeah, any ideas on fines or actions for those who do not comply? So I briefly talked about those 4 compliance pathways, Chuck. The last resort is building owner cannot use any of those 4 pathways to comply by the end of their cycle. Then the last resort is them paying a penalty. That penalty can be treated every day. It starts out as $500, but every day of non-compliance can be treated as a separate offense. And so those fines can rack up. But the bigger stick, if you will, coming from the city is our office will be working more closely now with our plan review section and our permitting sections of the building division. So there will be the potential denial of occupancy and other permits related to non-compliance. That's one of the things we're still that's one of the things that we're still coming to an agreement on how to do the enforcement of that. But the 2 sticks that we have right now is monetary fines that can rack up each day out of compliance, as well as the denial of future occupancy or other building permits. And this, oh, thanks, Freddie. This, I didn't get a chance to actually talk about the targets or show you the targets themselves, but this slide I have right in front of you. So these are the targets themselves, the standards for the over 20 property type groups here in the city of St. Louis. There is a specific methodology that our analysts use to do 2 things: to group the property types, because through benchmarking data, we had about 44 unique reporting property types. And then we use those to lump them into what we call these BEPS super categories, which knock them down to a little over 20 property types. And these are the property types that will be assigned to each of our buildings in the covered buildings list. And these are the targets themselves right here, that weather normalized site EUI. And for those who may not be familiar, compared with EUI and Energy Star score runs from 1 to 100. The higher the number, the more efficient your building is, or the more, the better chances you have for an Energy Star certification. With EUI, you want the numbers to go down. So if you have a lower EUI, the more efficient your building. So these targets right here are represented by the blue line along the scatter plot. And then you can see for a lot of these buildings, we have a lot of schools, we've got a lot of multifamily housing, warehousing, offices, and there's a lot of buildings right around that target. And then there's a lot of buildings that are very far off from the target. So hopefully with the 4 compliance pathways the board has approved, there will be, we'll have a lot of buildings in compliance right away. And we understand that there will be a lot of building owners relegated right away to the alternative compliance plan. And that's where we'll be working. They'll be working with our office and the board on how to best be into compliance. James, you had a question. It said, who will be handling enforcement of BEPS benchmarking? That will be the building division. Specifically, we've created a new office called the Office of Building Performance. I will be the program manager for that office, and we'll have 3 new staff by the end of this month working alongside me. So it will be the Office of Building Performance. It will be the city it will be the building division in our office doing the enforcement. BEX, the Building Energy Exchange, is meant to serve as that resource hub for building owners. But I don't want to speak on behalf of the USGBC. They can provide more context, but they're meant to be that resource arm. We are the compliance and enforcement agency. I think Morgan had a question too. I don't want to skip her. Yeah. Was it Morgan that had a question?
Yeah, she did. She was, and there was a couple of questions regarding it in relation to the expected GHG emissions reduction. that would be achieved if all buildings hit their targets. And this even goes to Paul Todd's question of what portion of the city's 2050 greenhouse gas reduction is projected to be achieved through BEPS.
Both two really good questions. So BEPS is definitely the single largest climate-related bill the city's passed to date, directly trying to address those greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, through city staffing issues during the pandemic, we weren't able to do like a cost to comply study or a study to see how much of a dent these buildings would make if all these buildings were compliant, and by the end of 2050, what would that mean for building emissions? We don't have that figure. That's something that we're going to actually, one of the resources we're going to try and develop with my new staff coming on board. And then to Morgan's question about expected greenhouse, would there be, is there expected? Oh yeah, the expected. Yeah, I just don't have those figures, unfortunately, right now, just because we haven't had, I haven't had staff to work on that. So unfortunately, not at this point.
So another question that did come up from Kyle, he asked, how were goals identified for building types that aren't eligible for Energy Star score because ES does not provide it for that building type? Assume there may be flexibility compliance to goal in that specific case.
Could you repeat that question? For some reason, my chat box is not opening.
Yeah, so it says, how were goals identified for building types that aren't eligible for an Energy Star score because it does not provide it for that building type?
Okay. For the Energy Star scores, yes. So, got it. Okay. So, one thing I'm going to drop in the chat is, so this is a link that I just shared with you all. That is a link to the city's dedicated page on the BEPS targets. They also list out our methodology. And one thing to reiterate, so our chief performance metric is using weather normalized site UI. We're not using Energy Star scores. So whether your building is eligible for a score or not, that doesn't have any relevancy to the standards themselves because they're relegated to site EUIs. So when you're benchmarking a property and portfolio manager, that's one of the metrics that will always be used. So for Energy Star score, that if you're 75 or above, then you're eligible for a certification. There are certain building types that don't get a score, but all building types get a metric of source and site EUI. And we use, thank you, Emily. Yeah, so one of the reasons we went with site UIs when we did our stakeholder process back through 2019 and 2020 is because so many buildings can't get an Energy Star score or are not eligible for an Energy Star score. It was one of the issues we were dealing with for a chief performance metric for the policy. Hence why another reason why we moved towards using weather normalized site UI.
So a follow-up question to that: as more sites become more compliant and hit these targets, will then the targets move and become more challenging?
So this policy is meant to be a continuous improvement policy. After each 4 and 6 year compliance cycle, what will happen is there will be a gap year. The building division will take a year to look at the most available benchmarking data and reevaluate the standards. So the standards will get more stringent over time, but our pathways will stay the same unless there's an amending process at some time in the future. But yes, it is meant to be a continuous improvement policy.
So
There's other
Rajiv,
questions I can take from folks.
you said at the beginning that, I think that this is what you said, but just for clarification, when submitting the information for each of the building types, you have to have someone certify that information before you submit it.
Yeah, so that is another piece. Thanks, Brandon. So I talked about data verification right here on this slide. So with the benchmarking ordinance, when that was written, there was no data verification piece included in the actual ordinance language. We at the building division we do our own data verification. So like in Portfolio Manager, there are a host of data quality checkers that the tool will use, that our user can run through before submitting their data. And then with our benchmarking system, we've got an additional layer of data quality checker. So just because you report, but you've got inaccurate data, we don't treat inaccurate submissions as compliant. But again, that wasn't something that was actually written into benchmarking. With BEPS, that's one of the pieces that we're still solidifying with rulemaking right now. Data verification will be required. So we will need a third party to verify your submission. And that is already something that is required for anyone who's pursuing an Energy Star certification. We'll be using a similar process where they have to use a professional architect or engineer to submit on behalf of the building owner for certification. We'll use that same process here with BEPS. When it comes to the alternative compliance plans, I made mention of a technical report for either of these compliance plans. So, for the custom one, we'll need to get you'll have to submit your audit report, who conducted that audit. We'll also need a physical description of the building, and then we'll need actual documentation of proof, support evidence of whatever ECMs you have selected are actually being implemented within your building. And so what will that level of rigor look like on behalf of the building owner? We are still working that out right now. One of the things that we've been working on behind the scenes is like a new BEPS dashboard within our reporting system that building owners will use, a feature which will be included in our master compliance document, our compliance guide.
So Hannah had a question about who are the suggested or possible certifiers, and will they have special training?
Yeah, that's a good question. Your second question about will they have special training, could you speak more to that, Hannah? I'm just wondering what you mean by that. And then in terms of your first question of who will these folks be, one of our resources is to come up with like a master guide of vendors people can use. We do have to be careful on who we recommend, obviously, right? I'm a city. I can't, recommend one over the other. We're just going to use all the available vendors used here locally, as well as the ones within our stakeholder group. But there are folks within both utilities, trade ally networks that folks can use in terms of professional engineers or architects. But I don't have the full list right now yet.
So I think where my question comes from is I'm an architect. I'm way past the time that I practice, but I'm very aware that I know a lot of architects that have almost no energy background training. And so that's why I'm asking, is there any special training or a little credential, or because if all you need to be is an architect, you're going to have some uninformed people being put in that position.
Yeah, that's a very valid point you're making. Hence why we still haven't, like the credentials or we're coming up with. We want to make sure we take into account folks that have this kind of experience doing audit, benchmarking, ECMs, that kind of work. So in terms of credentials, that's something that I'll work with the building division as well as with our board on coming up with those credentials. If they're, we can use this kind of feedback from you all. It'd be very helpful for me, but to the point you're making, yes, of course, we don't want to recommend folks who've never done this kind of thing or have no experience. I know portfolio manager, or like when you're going through the verification or certification with portfolio manager, that they have guidelines. One things that we may use. Oh, Emily, you actually make mention of that. That we may use. I'm also still talking to also my peer cities on this topic, on how they're coming up with those approved vendor lists for their verification piece. So still very much in the works on the credentials and what that list will look like.
Rajiv, final question before we wrap up. And since we're on this topic, have you heard any sort of pushback from any of the businesses or community regarding some of these compliance or really the BEPS?
No, not so much pushback. And Emily, feel free to chime in as well. Not so much, no, not pushback, no staunch, like, hell no, we're not going to comply with BEPS, or I've never heard of this before. We've been broadcasting this policy for over 2 years now, and using other channels to get people prepared. Emily and I gave a great presentation 2 weeks ago to the BOMA chapter. We've been having these coffee breaks. We've been doing sessions since last summer about these BEPS Q&A sessions that the USGBC's hosted. So nothing pushback on the passage part. I think, once these, our notification letters actually start hitting building owners' mailboxes and doorsteps, I think what there'll be that rush of panic on what do I do. Hence why we've been working with, yes, industrial clients are excluded. If your building's used primarily for manufacturing industrial, you're excluded from complying. But we've been talking to I've been talking to a lot of trade groups and the folks that actually do this kind of work, from the design world, the engineers, the architects, the consultants, and using them to talk to the clients that they work with on helping get ready for BEPS. I mean, we've already had folks reach out to the city on, I'm doing this sort of modeling for my building. For example, the Butler Brothers building downtown is going through a major renovation, and they're already trying to work with the city on a potential alternative compliance plan if based on their modeling they won't meet the standard. So no pushback, just a lot of outreach from the folks who represent building owners, so they can try and get them to understand, like, this is not a trend, this is a policy that's here to stay, and you've got this window to meet this first set of targets.
Thank you so much.
Shall we wrap up here since we're past 10:30?
Let's do that.
All right. Well, Rajiv, thanks for joining us today. And I will just, and thanks everyone for being here this morning. This is kind of a nice little preview to some events we have coming up in October related to benchmarking and energy efficiency. We have this benchmarking and energy efficiency carousel next Wednesday on Energy Efficiency Day. It's a free session at 8 a.m. and Rajiv is speaking along with a handful of other folks, including Kara Spencer, who'll talk just a little bit about the Building Energy Exchange and the work that she's going to be doing. We also have a benchmarking 101 session on October 29th, I believe, and a GPRO operations and maintenance training in November. So these are all kind of like a string of events that are all related. So, and then we have a couple more coffee breaks scheduled this month as well with some of our Green Shadow mentors. And our October program is on October 12th, which is a reschedule of our tour of Washington University's East End campus. That'll be a virtual tour. So lots going on, lots of ways to get engaged, and lots of opportunities to learn more about the city's really progressive climate action policies, which are being watched by people all over the country. It's very exciting. So have a great Friday, everyone.
Great job, Rajiv. Thank you.
Thanks. I put my email in the chat for folks, but Emily's got it too. If folks have more questions about the policy or just anything in general, just please feel free to reach out to me. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your Friday.
Bye-bye.